Welcome to Hot Yoga Radio this fine spring day in March 2021. Taking my constitutional. I'm off in the hills, it's very quiet here. You see the odd walker, but you don't see very many people. And this is a nice flat bit. Which means that you can talk without getting too out of breath. Okay, this is an interesting times episode. It's about current affairs. And it's a sort of an attempt to rehash and perhaps give a little bit of form to a conversation that Anna and myself had yesterday. And Anna can't be with me today, she's got things to do. But I did promise to see if I could organise our ideas and thoughts and hopefully insights into a useful and cogent podcast. Just going to start with a metaphor that I'm going to steal from Chris Hedges. Chris Hedges is a very great journalist and thinker, an American, an ordained Baptist minister, and a guy who spent many years in trouble spots in the world as a foreign correspondent, watching countries disintegrate into chaos and turmoil and civil war and war. So he's got a very good handle on the way societies fall apart. And Chris Hedges, as far back as I think 2019, 2020, certainly, was offering out the opinion that America was like a big pile of extremely dry tinder, and one spark would set it off into a conflagration. And he said that he didn't know where the spark would come from, and neither did anybody else, and it could even be some almost insignificant event could trigger off a complete conflagration of civil unrest, revolt, rebellion, mob activity, and so forth. Chris Hedges has carried on repeating this, and I've heard him say this very same thing recently, and I think he's right. And I think it applies in many parts of the world. Now, the way these conflagrations and mass rebellions pan out really depends on how organised various factions are and how prone, may say, the military is to intervene or not intervene and so forth, and how stable the institutions of the country in question are, and many sort of factors of that type. And very often they fall to the right. The right manages to mobilise and capture what Chris calls the manipulation of legitimate rage. Now, I think we are in a situation of that type in the United Kingdom. Some of my remarks are going to focus on that, though I will glance over the Atlantic and I will glance eastward also. So get that in your mind, the manipulation of legitimate rage. And if you want an example, the Brexit business and the way the UK public voted to leave the European Union by a fairly small majority, but nevertheless with a majority. And there was a huge manipulation of, first of all, of data collected by social media and other tech companies. You know, just a rampant manipulation. Not only was data used to predict people's behaviour, but to form it and shape it. And Cambridge Analytica, now dissolved, are worth investigating because you'll find what the methods are there, and the methods deriving from the ability to collect huge amounts of data, to sort through it with machine learning and nascent AI, artificial intelligence, and do this manipulation of behaviour, all in conjunction with the latest behavioural science. And it can be pretty effective. And Brexit was a case in point, as was the election of Trump. I mean, the whole Trump phenomenon was a manipulation of legitimate rage. And what's the source of this legitimate rage? Well, there are many sources of it, but mostly it's to do with economic decline, or the economic system itself having very unequal results across populations. Just putting it crudely, the 1% have got richer and richer and richer, and working people, ordinary working people, have experienced a stagnation of wages in real terms, and a decimation of their public services in many, many parts of the developed world. And a system which is likely to throw them into debt if they want an education and somewhere to live. So there's been a real cause for resentment. And I say resentment rests on a few things, but if you're going to put it sort of in big picture terms and broad strokes, it's to do with feeling powerless, not able to raise yourself up in life. Feeling that the corporations and the government does what they like with you, and the glimmerings of a perception of that. And I'm sure many Trump voters and many Brexit voters thought that they were voting against the establishment. Actually, they weren't. Their rage was just being manipulated to preserve the status quo behind a sort of surface veneer or a mask, a superficial mask of some kind of anti-establishmentism. Now, obviously, this has the material dimension of simply, becoming poor and maybe even destitute as a result of an economic system which is basically a trickle-up system, which is congealing and concentrating wealth and power in the hands of fewer and fewer people. And those few, that 1%, is actually an international, global elite, you might say, that operates mostly by manipulating finance, but also by manipulating key assets like oil and so forth, and also through military power, the military industrial complex. It's fairly complicated how that actually works, but it's pretty easy to demonstrate that the system is both locally in countries like ours and globally a trickle-up system. So there's a material aspect to the justifiable rage, but there's also obviously a cultural, superstructural, if you want to call it that, but a cultural aspect which I take to be very powerful in its causal power, its ability to make things happen. And this is manipulated through otherisation, blaming foreigners, Mexicans, build a wall, keep them out, asylum seekers coming across the English Channel in bathtubs, and of course we can have the spectacle of Nigel Farage standing on the beach and emoting, displaying his outrage to followers. So there's that otherisation, so divide and rule, blame others. Don't blame your government, don't blame the elites, blame already desperate people. And of course in the various conservative governments we've had over the years in the UK have been very, very good at this. And they've also created an internal other, the feckless, shameless benefit claimants. In America you've got the welfare queens. We blame them, the internal other. It's their fault, they're scrounged, they're not pulling the weight, etc. So you've got otherisation, divide and rule. Also deflect stories about the royal family, the whole kind of royal soap opera. Just deflects attention from what really is urgently important. And of course the 1% basically, again, broad brushstrokes, controls the press. And it's also a section of the 1% that owns all the big tech companies that control our data, that own our social media, which we use to try and communicate with each other, which they are sort of quite busily censoring. And governments are flexing their muscles with a view to further censorship. So that narratives which expose what's actually going on, that expose the trickle-up system, that expose the nature of otherisation and divide and rule and all the rest of the plots, are suppressed, or even deemed to originate in terrorism or something like that. So there's an ideological struggle going on, obviously, but a material struggle as well. And the two are not disconnected, you know. As far as I can see, superstructure and base are very, very strongly entangled with each other. It's a useful concept, but we mustn't overdraw it either. So in the British context, we've got this big pile of Tinder, and I can see at least three factors intensifying the dryness and the inflammability of that Tinder. And this is mostly what we were talking about yesterday. First Tinder intensifying scenario is the ongoing saga of Brexit. A lot of people say, oh well, it's all done and dusted now and it hasn't been so bad. You can still get toilet paper. And there's a weariness about the whole business as well, I think, and which perhaps tones down some of the discourse. Nevertheless, it's not done and dusted, and Brexit may not kind of fully happen, at least the deal may not happen. And there is still transitional measures in place in various sectors, and particularly with the border in the Irish Sea, for facilitating trade. In other words, by giving some leeway on the paperwork and the checks and so forth, so that trade can actually flow, that we don't get huge kind of blockages of trucks and ferries and all the rest of it, unable to move their stuff because of the sheer paperwork, the 17 copies in French and English of everything that they need to fill in. There is trouble on the horizon around that, in as much as the UK government has said it's going to unilaterally extend some of those easement protocols with respect to the flow of goods from Great Britain, the mainland, the biggest island in the British Isles, is Great Britain, and Northern Ireland, which is a part of the United Kingdom, but which is still in the customs union and single market, in order to preserve the invisible border between the Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic, which in turn is something that's guaranteed through the Good Friday Agreement, an international treaty hammered out in the 90s to bring an end to the troubles in Northern Ireland. In other words, a sectarian conflict, often bloody, between loyalists, or unionists as they're sometimes called, who want the northern part of Ireland to remain in the United Kingdom, and people who want a united Ireland, a division broadly running along Catholic Protestant lines and going historically back to the Battle of the Boyne in 1688 or 87, whenever it was, but somewhere way back there in the 17th century. Long memories, but nevertheless a nasty conflict that was brought to end by Tony Blair's government. It's something that he did. I'm quite happy to congratulate him on. Mo Molan is the heroine of that. Jeremy Corbyn actually is worth finding out that he had quite a good, interesting role in the whole process. But anyway, as a result of that, there's a fair bit of sabre rattling going on. An association of loyalist organisations, unionist organisations, written to the Prime Minister saying they no longer support the agreement. I mean, they would like a hard border on the island of Ireland, and it's ideologically unacceptable to them for there to be a border down the Irish Sea. In other words, an internal border with customs checks within the United Kingdom, which they are fiercely committed to that union, far more fiercely than your average English person who probably don't give a shit. But nevertheless, there's you can smell the gunpowder over there a bit. And this is not great. I mean, the other thing, I kind of reiterate that Brexit is far from implemented, with an agreement and all the rest of it. And it looks like there's a good possibility of no deal, because the actual 27 European countries each have to ratify the agreement. They have to read it and ratify it, and they're wanting more time to read the 800-page document and read all the small print. Incidentally, the British Parliament wasn't given enough time to do that. They were given a day, the MPs, to read 800 pages of legalese, which they weren't going to do, were they? So it's gone unscrutinised on this side, and rightfully the 27 EU countries want to scrutinise it, and that any one of them can veto it. Just one. Slovenia might veto it, or Lithuania. And if some part of their economy is going to be damaged by it, they'll veto it. So there's that possibility as well. So if you're one of those people think it's all sorted out and it's not so bad after all, I counsel you to think again. When all these easements finally disappear, and perhaps maybe we land in a WTO no-deal situation, Anna was of the opinion that Yellowhammer, the government's estimation of worst case and moderate case scenarios that would transpire if there were a no-deal situation, she thinks that could very well come in. You can kind of look at certain food shortages. Food price increase is going to happen anyway, I would say. Social unrest. The consequences will hit the poorer members of society disproportionately, and so forth. And there's a good chance that might transpire. It may not. There might be a rescue at the last minute. Anything is possible there, but it does look that by and large the whole Brexit thing is drying out that tinder. And I think if you get a lot of people having to go on food banks and all the rest of it, and the economic hit being sort of quite sorely felt, and there will be an economic hit of some percentage contraction of the economy in the best case scenario, let alone the worst case scenario. But there's going to be a fair bit of unrest and some resentment. The question is then, who's going to capture that resentment and use its emotional energy to their cause? And the two factions trying most intensely to capture that resentment, alienation, anger will be obviously the left and the far right. And we see this playing out time and time again. So another driver of this drying out of the flammable material of our body politic is, of course, the pandemic. The UK economy contracted 9.9% during our year of pandemic in the last year, in 2020, which is pretty well. A whole year of pandemic and lockdowns and fire breaks and all the rest of it. That's the biggest contraction in the UK economy since records began, since the Napoleonic Wars. Bigger than the 30s. Huge contraction. And the government's racked up a huge deficit in borrowing and QE money to, stop people from starving, and to pay for all the extra equipment and measures that needed to be taken, as well as furloughing workers, making payments to self-employed workers and bailing out companies, small and large. So they're now kind of claiming that they've got to claw some of the borrowing back, and of course there was a budget last week. Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, gave a budget, and this was uppermost in his mind, is the fact that GDP is the same as the what you might call the deficit. So the deficit's like over 100% of GDP. And he's one of those kind of economists. There's a Goldman Sachs man who thinks that's something he's got to start a little bit of belt tightening on. And the interesting thing is who is going to have to tighten the belt. Well, public sector workers, nurses, doctors, firemen, police, I suppose, all kinds of public servants. And I think by public sector they mean people who work in city councils and so forth. Have been told they've got a pay freeze. Now there is inflation. Inflation's quite low, but there is inflation. So that means people are actually slowly having their standard of living is sort of gradually being whittled away. Bear in mind that there have been wage stagnations since the 70s in real terms. So there's quite a lot of fury about that. Now in the budget, Mr Sunak said that the health service workers, the nurses in particular, would get a 1% pay rise for their sterling work during the pandemic. The pandemic's taken a hell of a toll on these workers. 900 of them have died from getting infected. And the NHS is short-staffed because of cuts, and it's not as coherent as it ought to be due to sort of privatisation of various aspects of it. This is further piled on the pressure onto the health service workers. And 1%, frankly, they regard almost universally as an insult, which it is. 1%, I say, is still below inflation, so they're still expected to take some kind of a pay cut, having absolutely worked their guts out and place themselves in danger for the common good. And nurses' unions and other workers in the NHS service, cleaners, porters, technicians, their unions, United's union with a big representation in the health service. They're talking about strike action. Now, the Royal College of Nursing, it's a kind of conservative, old-school union, and they have a sort of a no-strike policy because they can't put patients in danger. They do all that stuff about vocation and so forth. Even they are talking about strike action. They're fucking furious. Now, it's interesting that Sunak, when he presented this, he presented it as an act of generosity, and to show gratitude by the government on behalf of the people for the sterling work that the healthcare workers have done through the pandemic. Given that other public service workers have had their pay frozen, so they're making an exception and giving the nurses and so forth 1%. And they had the gall to present this as an act of generosity, as do other government ministers when they get wheeled in on the radio. Anyway, the interesting thing is that there is now some strike action on the horizon, and there's now a conflict between the professionals in the NHS and the government. Now, will this be the spark that lights the tinder? And I think there is general public support for the position of the nurses and et al. That this really is an insult. So, may you live in interesting times. At the moment, I would mention in the UK, there's also a strike by gas workers. And they've been on strike for over 3 weeks. I think it's 27, 28 days or something like that. Because the gas industry suddenly introduced this policy of sacking workers and offering to rehire them under worse conditions, longer hours, not such less generous pay, so forth. Anyway, it's enough to get these guys to go on strike. So there's that too, and that's kind of, I think the whole business went to arbitration yesterday or the day before, and the gas workers said no, fuck off. You can't treat us like this. And all power to them, and I think they do enjoy considerable support from the public. Now, obviously, there's going to be blimps and Tories and right-wing arseholes, tell them they ought to be horsewhipped and dragged through the streets, tarred and feathered, whatever, for being commie bastards. But, I say all power to them. All power to anybody who's actually putting their foot down and kind of flexing their muscles. I feel as though, like Labour, I don't mean the Labour Party, I mean Labour people who work just the very beginnings of flexing their muscles on in this situation. I think you should bear in mind, just to give this some interesting context, that the Conservative government have squandered billions, literally billions, by giving contracts for pandemic-related activities and products to private companies, basically to their mates, in some cases very, very blatantly to people with national companies who just happen to belong to the cabal of sort of right-wing press wallers, Tory politicians, corporate directors and so forth. And I've illustrated elsewhere, particularly in my investigation of Serco, that there is a very, very deep entanglement of state and corporations with a cabal of people at its core. This is all demonstrable. There's no conspiracy theory shit here. This is all stuff you can look up and demonstrate, and you could get it to hold in a court of law. It's that good. So we've already demonstrated that. The mainstream media is not so keen on reporting this. It ought to be on Radio 4 every morning, like the non-existent anti-Semitism of Jeremy Corbyn was. And it isn't, so you can see which side the mainstream media and the official state media are on. We don't hear so much about this. There's a little bit, because you can't fucking entirely ignore it, but this is chumocracy. It's corruption by any name. And the left alternative media do, of course, get on the case of this. And there's enough public people, and there's enough people in the public know what's gone on. They know that the people were given billions to supply PPE, and then when it came, it didn't work. It was the wrong sort. They knew that billions were spent on track and trace, and it never materialised in any kind of efficient way. We know this can be done from the examples of China and Vietnam and other countries that really did quite well, sitting on top of the pandemic with track and trace as one of the tools and as an effective tool. So there's no excuse, that in some general way this thing doesn't work. It has been made to work in other places. And I'm sure there's plenty of nurses know that, and I'm sure there's plenty of gas workers know that. I mean, here's another example. I mean, the teachers got pretty grumpy about being told to go back to school. just after Christmas, sometime around Christmas, forget the exact dates. The kids went back for one day, and then the government took them out. So the teachers said no, and they'd got a good strategy worked out of how to sort of say that they weren't going to go into school and teach because it would be in breach of a health and safety law. And they're entitled to stay at home and be paid in order to protect their own health and safety. And they wheeled this across the government, and the government capitulated. So it is working people, teachers, flexed their muscles, and the government capitulated. They also capitulated on free school meals in the holidays because of pressure applied by a prominent football player who got an immense amount of public support behind him. That's worth mentioning as well. Now, it's slightly different, but it shows that pressure can be put on the government and they can be forced back. I actually think that the structure of the corporate government oligarchy is a lot more flimsy than most of us think. We have actually been conditioned very thoroughly to think that there is no alternative. Tina, there is no alternative, or capitalist realism, as Mark Fisher said, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. But I actually think that the thing that we're up against is more fragile than we think, and a widespread realisation of that, with a few successes on the front of industrial action and of the front of social campaigns. And I'm pretty sure that the school kids' climate strikes and the activities of Extinction Rebellion have forced the government to budge a little bit in the right direction. So we've got more power than we think is basically the upshot of what I'm kind of getting at with all this. However, the left everywhere is pretty disorganised. And if the Tinder catches fire, at the moment, I think the right would have quite a good chance of prevailing, because they, in some senses, have got their ducks in a row, even though they've took a bit of a hit recently, and they've got their own organisational problems. But we should bear in mind, that the World Economic Forum is very, very busy organising the world's major corporations and the oligarchs at the top of them on a global scale to replace the international institutions that do have a degree of accountability, like the United Nations, with unaccountable corporate entities which have more or less captured governments here, there and everywhere. The fascism going global is what's basically happening. And I've sort of found more evidence of the extent and the depth that project has attained. So the upshot is the left, and by the left, and I don't mean the small sectarian, I mean the broad coalition of people of goodwill needs to really organise, and to cross-organise, it needs to network and exchange information in order to eventually to be able to coordinate. Then this, because most people, when push comes to shove, and if they're kind of encouraged to think and analyse a little bit, are people of goodwill. We are many, they are few. And the situation is full of possibilities, and I say we're seeing these glimmers of hope. I mean, in India, the farmers strike, supported by the workers in their kind of, hundreds of millions, is extremely encouraging. What we don't want to happen is that when this stuff catches fire and there is a conflagration, that we have a sublime moment like occupy Wall Street and occupy London. But then it dissipates, the police break it up, the society, the state fights back and it prevails through force and whatever. Other things runs out of energy and impetus and momentum. And then the activists are left kind of flapping around and wondering what to do. We are kind of in that situation a little bit. You know, after the smashing, the vicious press campaign against the Corbyn project, which we have to remember attracted hundreds of thousands of young people willing to give their energy to a struggle to realise a vision. They haven't gone away, but they're kind of flapping around saying, well, who do we follow? What do we think that, you know, what's going on here? So, organisation, and obviously this union revival, I think, is pretty amazing, and it needs organised labour. Organised labour's got an immense amount of power if it wants to, if it can get organised. Immense amount. That can close down the economy for a start. You know, but the social movements too, and they're extremely valuable. It's necessary for people who are so committed to make a lot of noise about environmental degradation, of which climate change is the most obvious and one of them, and extremely dangerous to our species. So all that needs to happen as well, and if the things can be pulled into some sort of moderate coordination, unstoppable, but there's all this organisational work to do now. And there are many, many fronts on which it can be done. It's not we all have to join one mass movement, you know, but it's the movements need to speak and coordinate and exchange. So, the way of pulling those diverse components of the huge collective of people of goodwill, of the broad left, if you want to call it that, it is a utopian vision. Because that means we can all be going in roughly the same direction. We're all going south at least. You know, perhaps in a broad swathe, you know, but we're all heading kind of southish. We ain't got half the people heading north, half the people heading south, some standing on the spot and twirling around like dervishes. And it's a utopian vision that enables that to happen, and that is the purpose of utopias. Now, I've said before, they are dangerous. People can realise officiously to realise their utopias, then they won't compromise. They make the perfect the enemy of the good. And they won't react in an intelligent way to contingencies, to black swan events and things that need some fresh thinking and on the hoof. And they'll double down, and you do end up with disasters when a utopian idea usurps all the energy or is used improperly. Its proper use is to send us all in the same direction. Its proper use is to enable us to use imagination to identify what it is that we value and what kind of society we want to live in and what kind of society we want to leave to our children, grandchildren and great-grandchildren. That's what it's for, and that's what we need. So I think we shouldn't be frightened of articulating these ideas and having the conversation and having the argument and using our imaginations. And that will enable all that flapping around and directionlessness to at least be mitigated. And when we have a sublime moment, we'll be ready for the day after. We won't do Tahrir Square with all its revolutionary idealism, followed by a despotic military regime somewhere down the line. Now, I think there are some good signs of organisation, and I think there's a lot needs to be done internationally, because a lot of these problems can only be dealt with internationally. And the World Economic Forum and the corporate oligarchs need pushing back from their attempt to become the the focuses of power in the world that determine the future. Even though they'll talk about socially responsible capitalism, when push comes to shove, the bottom line will be all that they care about. That is just a fucking cover story. That's pure ideology. Don't buy it. But on the positive side, the Peace and Justice initiative that Jeremy Corbyn kicked off, immensely promising. DM25, Yanis Varoufakis' A Democracy in Europe movement. In the US, I don't know, moves perhaps towards a People's Party, but also the struggle within the Democratic Party to primary, more radical representatives. And there's some promise in that. It's gas problems, but there's promise in it. And of course the rise of media, the rise of alternative media, that need to be the forum in which this stuff gets aired. And a part of that, of course, is to expose the way the mainstream media is really an ideological operation for preserving the status quo. So there's a lot there. And of course it looks as though there's a revivification in trade union activity. Not least the discovery that the precariat can be unionised. So there's a lot of stuff going on. I think all of these tendencies need to talk to each other. We need to use our imaginations to find our direction, our values, our strategies. Let's make this practical as well. You need a vision, but you also need an action plan. Well, I hope that's kind of useful and it hasn't been too diffuse. Make knowledge great again. Wash your hands. Take care of yourselves. Patrons, thank you very much for the few bob. It's very helpful. And I'm hoping that we can increase the output a bit. It's been a little bit low, but as I've said before, I am researching stuff all over the place. I think I've raised my standards of rigour. I want to be a bit more certain of facts and figures, and when I make claims, I want to kind of check them out, see how well they can hold up. Lots of love, and over and out.